Zekthal stood before the massive viewing screen in the High Council chamber and felt his three hearts beating in different rhythms. The blue-skinned alien had served as a xenobiologist for over 200 cycles and had observed dozens of primitive species across the galaxy. Today's assignment should have been routine work, but something about the way Council Leader Mortak spoke made his skin change to a nervous purple shade. Observer Zekthal, you will travel to the Kepler 442 system to document human military behavior. During their conflict with the Vorthan Empire, the ancient council leader announced through his translator device, "Your mission is simple observation and documentation for our historical records." Zekthal bowed his elongated head and accessed the species data through his neural implant. Humans were a recently discovered bipedal species from a small blue planet. They called Earth. According to the files, they stood barely 2 meters tall and lacked natural armor or weapons. Their technology was primitive compared to most galactic civilizations, and they had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the past 50 cycles. Most concerning was their incredibly short lifespan of less than 100 cycles, which should make them unsuitable for any serious military conflict. "Honored Council Leader, why are we observing such a primitive species?" Zekthal asked while reviewing the combat data. "The files show they have engaged the Vorthan Empire in direct warfare, but this seems impossible given their obvious disadvantages." Mortek's ancient features darkened and his voice carried undertones of confusion. "That is precisely why we need documentation, Zekthal. 3 Vorthan battle fleets have engaged human forces in the past 10 cycles, and none have achieved the swift victories our models predicted. The Vorthans report unusual human tactics that require further study." The observer felt his curiosity growing as he studied the tactical reports. The Vorthan Empire had conquered 17 different species over the past 1,000 cycles. Using their superior plasma weaponry and overwhelming numerical advantage, their warriors stood 3 meters tall with natural bone armor and redundant organ systems that made them extremely difficult to kill in combat. How could weak primitive humans possibly pose any challenge to such a formidable military force? "What specific behaviors should I focus on during my observations?" Zekthal inquired while calibrating his recording equipment. "Document their surrender. Protocols and final tactical decisions before defeat," Mortak replied dismissively. "The Vorthans claim humans exhibit irrational behavior patterns that contradict standard military doctrine, but we suspect this is merely primitive panic responses. Your documentation will help us understand how fear affects less developed species when facing superior opponents." Zekthal loaded his personal observation vessel with standard monitoring equipment and prepared for the journey to human space. His ship was equipped with advanced cloaking technology that would allow him to observe the coming battle without detection from either side. The vessel's computer systems contained extensive databases on both human and Vorthan military capabilities, which would help him analyze whatever conflict he witnessed during the 3-day journey through hyperspace. Zekthal studied everything available about human culture and psychology. Their species seemed remarkably attached to individuals within their social groups and displayed strong emotional responses to threats against their offspring or mates. This emotional instability would likely make them poor soldiers compared to the disciplined Vorthan warriors who fought with cold logical precision. The humans had established a colony called New Haven on the 3rd planet of the Kepler 442 system, approximately 20 cycles ago. Intelligence reports indicated the colony housed roughly 2 million human civilians engaged in agricultural and mining operations. The strategic value of the system was minimal, which made the Vorthan interest somewhat puzzling, but military expansion rarely followed logical patterns among warrior species. Zekthal emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system and immediately activated his cloaking systems. His sensors detected a small human fleet positioned in defensive formation around the inhabited planet. The ships appeared to be older models with basic kinetic weaponry and primitive armor plating. Leading the defensive force was a vessel designated as the Liberty under the command of someone called Jake Morrison, according to intercepted communications. As his ship drifted closer to optimal observation range, Zechthel reviewed the incoming Vorthan fleet composition through long-range sensors. 15 heavy cruisers accompanied by twice that number of smaller attack vessels were approaching the system at standard battle speed. The size difference between the opposing forces was almost comical, with human ships appearing like insects next to the massive Vorthan warships. "This will be a very short observation mission," Zechthel muttered to himself while positioning his recording equipment. The mathematical probability of human victory was so low that his computer systems couldn't even calculate meaningful odds. He expected to document a brief skirmish followed by rapid human surrender and Vorthan occupation of the planet. The observer settled into his monitoring station and began recording as the two fleets moved toward their inevitable confrontation. Within a few hours, he would complete his documentation and file a standard report about another primitive species learning the hard realities of galactic warfare. Everything about this assignment seemed routine and predictable, which made Zechthel wonder why the High Council had shown such unusual interest in human military behavior. The Vorthan fleet dropped out of hyperspace like predators emerging from darkness, and Zechthel immediately began recording the engagement through his ship's advanced sensors. The massive alien warships moved in perfect formation with their dark hulls gleaming under the system's yellow star. Each Vorthan cruiser was easily 10 times larger than the biggest human vessel and bristled with plasma cannons that could melt through most known armor materials. "Commander," Jake Morrison's voice crackled across the human communication channels as he addressed his small fleet. "All ships maintain defensive positions around New Haven and prepare for incoming fire. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves today, but for every man, woman, and child on that planet below us." Zechthel noticed something unusual in the human commander's tone. Instead of the fear or desperation he expected from a doomed military, Leader Morrison sounded almost calm, with an underlying edge of determination that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. The observer adjusted his recording equipment to capture both audio and visual data from the approaching battle. The Vorthan fleet commander issued a standard surrender demand through subspace channels, but the humans responded by powering up their weapons and moving into attack formations. Zechthel found this response puzzling, since any rational species would recognize the impossibility of victory against such overwhelming odds and attempt to negotiate surrender terms that might preserve some civilian lives. "Vorthan fleet, this is Commander Morrison of the Human Defense Force. Your demand for surrender is denied. If you want our world, you'll have to take it from us." The battle began exactly as Zechthel had predicted, with the Vorthan fleet unleashing devastating plasma barrages that instantly vaporized 3 human ships. The primitive kinetic weapons fired by the human vessels barely scratched the advanced armor plating of their enemies. Within minutes, half the human fleet was either destroyed or severely damaged, while the Vorthans had suffered no meaningful casualties. Then something happened that made Zechthel question his understanding of rational military behavior. Instead of retreating or requesting surrender terms, Commander Morrison ordered his remaining ships to break formation and engage the enemy at close range. The surviving human vessels accelerated directly toward the massive Vorthan cruisers in what appeared to be suicide attacks. All units switched to close engagement protocols and make every shot count. "If we're going down, we're taking some of these bastards with us." Lieutenant Amy Carter was piloting a badly damaged fighter craft that had lost most of its weapon systems and was leaking atmosphere through multiple hull breaches. Any sane pilot would have ejected or attempted to retreat to safety, but instead she aimed her crippled ship directly at the engine section of a Vorthan cruiser. Zechthel watched in horrified fascination as the small human vessel slammed into the much larger enemy ship at maximum velocity. The resulting explosion took out the cruiser's primary drive systems and sent it spinning helplessly through space. Carter's sacrifice had eliminated a ship carrying over 2,000 Vorthan warriors. But the observer couldn't understand why any intelligent being would choose certain death when survival alternatives existed. In his peaceful civilization, such behavior would be considered a sign of severe mental illness. On the planet's surface, Captain Ben Hayes was coordinating ground defenses as Vorthan dropships began landing outside the main colonial settlements. The human military force consisted of fewer than 5,000 soldiers equipped with basic projectile weapons, facing an invasion force of 20,000 heavily armored Vorthan warriors. Mathematical analysis suggested the ground battle would last less than 6 hours. Sergeant Lisa Murphy commanded a small outpost that controlled access to the main civilian evacuation routes. When her position was surrounded by Vorthan forces, she received orders to fall back and preserve her unit for later defensive actions. Instead, Murphy chose to hold her position even though it meant certain death for herself and her soldiers. "Command, this is Sergeant Murphy at Checkpoint 7. We're surrounded and outnumbered, but we're not pulling back. These families need time to reach the shelters, and we're going to give it to them no matter what it costs," Zechthel observed through orbital sensors as Murphy's 20-person unit fought against overwhelming odds for over 3 hours. When their ammunition ran low and Vorthan warriors began overrunning their positions, the humans made a decision that shocked the alien observer. Instead of surrendering, they detonated their own ammunition depot, creating a massive explosion that eliminated dozens of enemy soldiers and blocked the evacuation route for several more hours. The observer found himself physically disturbed by what he was witnessing. His species had evolved beyond violent conflict millions of cycles ago, and the concept of willing self-sacrifice for others was completely foreign to his understanding. Yet these primitive humans seemed to embrace death as a tactical option, which suggested either complete insanity or something far more complex than simple aggression. "Commander, Morrison's ship was badly damaged and down to emergency power, but he continued, coordinating the defense through damaged communication systems." When offered terms for a conditional surrender by the Vorthan fleet commander, Morrison's response defied all logical military doctrine. "Vorthan commander, this is Jake Morrison. I've got one thing to tell you about conditional surrender. You can take your terms and shove them straight to hell? We'll die before we let you harm innocent people." Dr. Kate Phillips was aboard the medical vessel Mercy, which was clearly marked with non-combatant symbols according to galactic warfare conventions. When Vorthan fighters began targeting the hospital ship instead of retreating to safety, the human medical staff continued treating wounded soldiers from both sides while under direct enemy fire. Phillips personally remained at her surgical station. Even as explosions rocked the ship around her, Zechthel realized he was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior. These humans were fighting beyond any rational hope of victory and seemed to draw strength from their desperate circumstances rather than being weakened by them. The observer began to question whether his mission documentation would adequately explain what he was seeing to the peaceful species of the Galactic Confederation. The conflict had been raging for 18 hours when Zechthel witnessed something that made his peaceful mind struggle to process what his sensors were recording. The medical ship Mercy was clearly marked with Red Cross symbols that should have protected it under galactic warfare conventions, but several Vorthan fighters had begun targeting the hospital vessel with plasma fire. Instead of the expected response of medical evacuation or surrender the entire remaining human fleet abandoned their defensive positions to protect the non-combatant ship. Commander Morrison's damaged flagship limped through space-trailing atmosphere and debris, but he still managed to position his vessel between the Mercy and attacking Vorthan fighters. "All ships converge on the Mercy immediately. I don't care what tactical advantage we lose. Nobody fires on a hospital ship while we're still breathing." Zechthel found this behavior completely irrational from a military perspective. The humans were sacrificing strategic positioning and combat effectiveness to protect a single, non-combat vessel that had no tactical value in the overall battle. Yet as he monitored human communications, the observer detected no doubt or hesitation in their voices as they rushed to defend their medical ship. Dr. Kate Phillips continued performing surgery aboard the Mercy while explosions rocked the vessel around her. Through intercepted internal communications, Zechthel heard her speaking to her medical team as they treated wounded soldiers from both human and Vorthan forces without discrimination. "I don't care if the whole ship is falling apart. Around us, we have patients who need treatment, and that's our job. Keep those surgical lights steady and hand me another blood pack." This Vorthan warrior is going to live whether he wants to or not? The observer noticed that Phillips and her staff were treating enemy wounded with the same dedication they showed to human casualties. This behavior violated every principle of warfare that Zechthel understood, since providing medical aid to enemy forces only strengthened their ability to continue fighting. Yet the human medical personnel seemed driven by some internal code that transcended military logic. Major Chris Johnson received intelligence about human prisoners being held in a captured mining facility on New Haven's northern continent. The facility had no strategic importance and was heavily defended by Vorthan forces, making any rescue attempt a suicide mission. Despite these obvious facts, Johnson began organizing a rescue operation that would require his best soldiers to penetrate deep into enemy territory. I know the odds are terrible, and I know Command hasn't authorized this mission. Johnson addressed his volunteer team through encrypted channels. But we've got 12 good people trapped in that facility, and we don't leave anyone behind. That's, not a suggestion or a military order. That's who we are as human beings. Zechthel watched 20 human soldiers volunteer for a mission that mathematical analysis suggested had less than 5% chance of success. The rescue team would be abandoning defensible positions and using limited resources to save a handful of prisoners who represented minimal tactical value. Yet, every volunteer seemed eager to participate despite the obvious dangers. The rescue mission began with Johnson's team using captured Vorthan equipment to infiltrate enemy lines during the planet's night cycle. They moved through dangerous territory for over 6 hours before reaching the mining facility where their fellow humans were being held. The compound was defended by nearly 200 Vorthan warriors equipped with heavy weapons and energy barriers. Rather than attempting stealth extraction or negotiating prisoner exchange, Johnson's team launched a direct assault on the heavily fortified position. Zechthel observed the battle through thermal imaging as human soldiers fought through overwhelming resistance to reach their captured comrades. The rescue team suffered 60% casualties but managed to extract all 12 prisoners from Vorthan custody. Private Sam Torres was part of a small patrol unit that became separated from main human forces during a Vorthan counterattack. His squad leader, Corporal Dan Miller, was killed during the engagement, leaving Torres alone with Miller's body in hostile territory. Instead of abandoning the corpse and attempting to escape, Torres chose to defend his fallen comrades' remains. Against approaching Vorthan soldiers, Zechthel monitored Torres through battlefield sensors as the young human constructed a defensive position around Miller's body using scattered debris and damaged equipment. When Vorthan warriors offered him medical treatment in exchange for information about human defensive positions, Torres refused, despite suffering from serious wounds that would prove fatal without treatment. "You can kill me, but you're not getting anything from me, and you're not touching my friend," Torres spoke into his communication device, knowing other humans might intercept his final message. "Tell my family I did my job, and tell them Dan Miller died like a hero defending innocent people." The observer watched Torres continue fighting until Vorthan plasma fire finally ended his resistance. The young human died clutching his squad leaders' identification tags while protecting a corpse that had no tactical value whatsoever. This behavior was so far beyond rational military conduct that Zechtel's analytical systems couldn't classify it within any known framework. As the battle continued into its second day, Zechthel began experiencing symptoms that his medical training identified as psychological contamination. He was having difficulty maintaining objective scientific detachment while observing human combat behavior. The violent images he recorded were causing sleep disturbances and emotional responses that interfered with his analytical capabilities. The observer tried to focus on documented Vorthan tactics and conventional military analysis, but found himself constantly drawn back to monitoring individual human soldiers as they made inexplicable decisions. These primitive beings seemed to operate according to principles that transcended logical self-preservation and challenged everything his peaceful civilization understood about intelligent behavior. Lieutenant Jenny Adams was defending a civilian shelter when her ammunition ran out and Vorthan forces began advancing on her position. Instead of surrendering or retreating, Adams used improvised explosive devices to collapse the shelter entrance while she was still inside, effectively sealing herself in with the civilians she was protecting. Her sacrifice prevented enemy access to over 50 non-combatant humans, but cost her own life in the process. On the third day of battle, something unprecedented happened that would challenge everything Zechthel thought he understood about galactic warfare. The humans stopped fighting defensively and began doing something no other species had ever attempted against Vorthan forces. Commander Morrison issued orders that made the alien observer question whether the human military leader had suffered complete mental breakdown. All remaining ships prepare for boarding operations. We're taking this fight directly to their ships and showing these bastards what close-quarters combat looks like. Zechthel's analytical systems struggled to process this tactical decision. Boarding actions against Vorthan vessels were considered impossible due to the aliens' physical advantages and superior numbers aboard their own ships. The Vorthans stood 3 meters tall with natural bone armor and redundant organ systems that made them extremely difficult to kill in hand-to-hand combat. Yet Morrison was ordering his damaged ships to dock with enemy vessels for direct infantry assault. The first boarding action began when Morrison personally led a team of 30 human Marines aboard a Vorthan cruiser using his crippled flagship as a battering ram. The Liberty slammed into the enemy vessel's docking bay and created a breach that allowed human soldiers to pour into the ship's corridors. Zechthel monitored the engagement through internal sensors and watched something that defied all military logic. The humans were actually winning inside the Vorthan ship despite being outnumbered and physically outmatched. They moved through the vessel's corridors in small coordinated teams, using tactics that seemed designed specifically for fighting larger, stronger opponents. When confronted by heavily armored Vorthan warriors, the humans used explosive devices and concentrated firepower rather than attempting individual combat. Captain Rachel Torres led her squad through the engineering section of a Vorthan dreadnought while taking heavy casualties from defending enemy forces. When her team was cornered in the ship's reactor chamber with no escape route, Torres made a decision that shocked even the battle-hardened Vorthan crew. Instead of surrendering, she began overloading the vessel's power core. "Command, this is Captain Torres aboard enemy vessel designation 7. We're trapped in their engineering section and taking heavy fire. I'm initiating reactor overload in 60 seconds. Tell my daughter I love her and that Mommy did something important today." Zechthel watched in horrified fascination as Torres and her remaining soldiers held their position, while the ship's reactor built toward critical overload. The Vorthan crew began evacuating the engineering section, but the humans continued fighting even as radiation levels climbed to lethal ranges. The massive enemy vessel exploded in a brilliant flash that eliminated over 3,000 Vorthan warriors along with Torres and her entire squad. The observer began detecting something in Vorthan communications that he had never heard before in over 2 centuries of documenting various conflicts. The warrior species that had conquered 17 different civilizations was beginning to show signs of fear when facing human boarding parties. Their tactical communications revealed growing reluctance to engage in close-quarters combat with the smaller but inexplicably dangerous humans. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Mitchell commanded ground forces defending New Haven's capital city when Vorthan dropships began landing in the urban areas. His military units were severely depleted after 3 days of continuous fighting, but Mitchell received unexpected reinforcement from an impossible source. Civilian volunteers led by a schoolteacher named Mary Johnson had organized themselves into militia units. "Colonel Mitchell, this is Mary Johnson with about 200 civilian volunteers. We know we're not trained soldiers, but we're not sitting in shelters while our world burns. Tell us where you need us and we'll do whatever it takes," Zechthel observed. Through orbital surveillance, as children barely old enough to hold weapons joined their parents in defensive positions throughout the city. These non-combatant humans were charging Vorthan positions alongside professional soldiers while showing the same inexplicable disregard for personal safety that characterized their military forces. The sight of human youngsters attacking 3-meter-tall alien warriors seemed to disturb even the hardened Vorthan troops. The boarding actions continued as more human vessels rammed enemy ships to create entry points for infantry assault. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez led a team through the command section of a Vorthan battlecruiser while fighting room by room against desperate defenders. When his squad reached the bridge, Rodriguez faced the enemy ship's commander in single combat using nothing but close-range weapons. The Vorthan bridge crew watched their captain fall to a human soldier who stood barely half his height and lacked any natural armor or weapons. Rodriguez activated the ship's self-destruct sequence before Vorthan reinforcements could reach the bridge, effectively eliminating another enemy vessel through boarding action. The psychological impact on surviving Vorthan forces was becoming measurable through intercepted communications. Zechthel reports to the High Council were becoming increasingly incoherent as he struggled to explain tactical developments that violated every principle of conventional warfare. How could he describe to peaceful species the sight of human children fighting alongside their parents against overwhelming odds? How could he quantify the combat effectiveness of soldiers who seemed to grow stronger as their situation became more desperate? The Vorthan fleet commander issued new tactical orders that revealed the extent of human psychological warfare effectiveness. Enemy units were instructed to avoid close quarters engagement whenever possible and to retreat rather than risk boarding actions. The species that had never shown fear in battle was now actively avoiding direct confrontation with numerically inferior human forces. Captain Jim Parker organized the defense of a civilian evacuation convoy when Vorthan ground forces attempted to intercept fleeing colonists. His small escort unit was outnumbered 50-1, but Parker led a frontal assault against the enemy formation rather than attempting to outrun pursuit. The attack was so unexpected and ferocious that Vorthan forces broke formation and retreated. Despite their overwhelming numerical advantage, the observer realized he was witnessing a fundamental shift in the balance of power as human tactics began producing results that mathematical analysis suggested were impossible. The Vorthans were losing ships and personnel at rates that would normally indicate imminent victory for their opponents, despite maintaining significant advantages in numbers and technology. Something about human warfare was proving more effective than superior firepower or advanced equipment. Mary Johnson's civilian militia captured several Vorthan weapons during urban fighting and began using enemy equipment against its former owners. The schoolteacher personally destroyed an enemy transport vehicle using captured plasma grenades while protecting a group of evacuating families. Her actions inspired other civilian volunteers to attempt increasingly dangerous attacks against Vorthan positions throughout the city. After 6 days of impossible warfare, the unthinkable happened, and Zechthel watched the mighty Vorthan fleet begin withdrawing from the Kepler 442 system. The alien observer's sensors detected the enemy ships powering up their hyperspace drives and preparing to abandon their invasion of New Haven. For the first time in galactic history, the Vorthan Empire was retreating from a militarily inferior opponent. The human victory came at a cost that would have destroyed any other species Zechthel had ever studied. Over 70% of the human military forces were either dead or severely wounded. Entire family bloodlines had been eliminated during the fighting, and most of the planet's infrastructure lay in ruins. Yet, as the observer monitored human communications, he detected no celebration or triumph in their voices. Commander Morrison's flagship Liberty drifted powerless in space with massive hull breaches that left most of the ship uninhabitable. The human commander had lost his left arm during the final boarding action, but was still coordinating rescue operations for survivors, floating in escape pods throughout the system. His voice over emergency channels carried exhaustion and grief rather than the satisfaction of victory. All ships with operational life support begin search and rescue operations immediately. I want every survivor located and recovered regardless of their species. That includes Vorthan personnel who may need medical assistance. The observer found this final human behavior even more incomprehensible than their combat tactics. After suffering devastating casualties during a brutal war, the survivors were offering medical aid to enemy wounded rather than seeking revenge or allowing their opponents to die. Dr. Phillips aboard the damaged Mercy was treating Vorthan prisoners. Alongside human casualties without any apparent discrimination, Captain Ben Hayes returned to New Haven's surface with his face permanently scarred by plasma burns and his right leg, requiring mechanical assistance for mobility. Instead of seeking medical treatment for his own injuries, Hayes immediately began organizing reconstruction efforts in the devastated colonial settlements. Zechthel observed him working 18-hour shifts to clear debris and establish temporary shelters for displaced civilians. The aftermath of battle revealed the true scope of human losses in ways that raw casualty statistics couldn't convey. Morrison personally visited the families of every soldier who had died under his command, spending weeks delivering death notifications and attending memorial services. The observer watched him break down emotionally while speaking to the widow of Lieutenant Carter, who had sacrificed herself during the war's opening hours. "Sarah, your husband died protecting everything we hold dear, and his sacrifice saved thousands of lives. I know that doesn't make the pain any easier, but I need you to understand that Amy's courage made the difference between survival and extinction for our entire colony." Zechthel recorded memorial ceremonies where the surviving humans honored their dead with a solemnity that suggested they fully understood the price of their impossible victory. Young Private Jenny Adams was one of the few survivors from her original unit and broke down while reading the names of fallen comrades at a ceremony attended by hundreds of grieving families. The observer studied human behavior during the reconstruction period and discovered something that disturbed him more than their combat ferocity. Despite suffering losses that should have broken their spirit completely, the survivors were already preparing for future Vorthan attacks. Intercepted communications revealed plans for expanded military production and improved defensive fortifications. "The Vorthans will be back eventually, and we need to be ready when they come." Morrison addressed the Colonial Council while his damaged arm was still healing from combat injuries. "This victory bought us time, but it didn't end the war. We need to use every day we have to prepare for the next battle." Dr. Phillips worked around the clock treating wounded survivors, many of whom would never fully recover from their injuries. The medical ship Mercy had been severely damaged during the fighting, but Phillips refused evacuation to better-equipped facilities on other human worlds. She continued operating makeshift surgical facilities. While grieving for medical staff who had died protecting their patients, Major Johnson organized training programs for civilian militia units using lessons learned during the recent battle. The officer who had led the impossible prisoner rescue mission was now teaching school children basic combat techniques, while their parents learned to maintain captured Vorthan weapons. The entire human colony was transforming itself into a military fortress. Zechthel observed families throughout the colony dealing with losses that would have destroyed most species. Parents who had lost children continued working to rebuild their community, while children who had become orphans were adopted by other families without question or hesitation. The social bonds that held human society together seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker under extreme stress. Teacher Mary Johnson had survived the urban fighting but lost her husband during the defense of the capital city. Instead of retreating into grief, she organized educational programs that taught survival skills alongside traditional academic subjects. Her classroom became a training center where human children learned military tactics along with reading and mathematics. The observer reviewed his extensive recordings of human behavior during and after the battle, trying to understand what made this species so different from others he had studied. The mathematical analysis was clear that humans had achieved victory through tactics that violated every principle of rational military doctrine, yet they had somehow made the impossible work through sheer determination. Private Sam Rodriguez had survived his boarding action aboard the Vorthan cruiser but suffered permanent neurological damage from plasma weapon exposure. Despite his disabilities, Rodriguez volunteered for training duty and spent his days teaching new recruits close quarters combat techniques. His experiences fighting inside enemy ships became textbook material for future boarding operations. Zechthel realized that human strength came not from their willingness to die in battle, but from their refusal to allow death to rob meaning from life. They fought desperately not because they didn't fear death, but because they feared the destruction of everything they loved more than they feared their own mortality. This fundamental difference made them unlike any other species in the galaxy. Captain Torres had been posthumously promoted and her daughter received full military honors during a ceremony attended by the entire surviving colonial population. The 8-year-old girl accepted her mother's medal while promising to follow her example when she grew old enough to serve. Zechthel found this continuity of purpose across generations both inspiring and terrifying in its implications for galactic peace. Zechthel returned to the Galactic Confederation homeworld after 30 days of observing human reconstruction efforts, but found himself completely unable to compile a standard observation report. The data he had collected challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior that form the basis of peaceful galactic civilization. How could he explain to species that had evolved beyond warfare that humans found strength in their very mortality? The High Council summoned him for preliminary briefing before his formal report submission, and Zechthel attempted to describe what he had witnessed on New Haven. Council leader Mortek and 12 other ancient beings listened through their translation devices as the observer struggled to find words that could convey the reality of human combat behavior to minds that had never experienced violent conflict. Honored Council members, the humans achieved victory through tactics that mathematical analysis indicates should be impossible. They engaged in direct boarding actions against superior opponents and succeeded through coordinated sacrifice rather than individual survival instinct. Mortaka's expression showed confusion as his mental processes tried to parse concepts that had no equivalent in peaceful civilization. Observer Zechthel, please clarify your use of the term coordinated sacrifice. Are you suggesting these humans deliberately chose death over survival as a military strategy? Zechthel activated his recording equipment and displayed footage of Captain Torres overloading the Vorthan reactor while surrounded by enemy forces. The images showed the human soldier calmly initiating a nuclear explosion that would kill herself along with thousands of opponents. Several council members required immediate psychological treatment after viewing the recording, and the session was suspended while medical personnel attended to their trauma. When the briefing resumed 3 days later, the council approached Zechtel's findings with extreme caution. The concept of willing self-destruction for tactical advantage was so foreign to their understanding that they questioned whether the observer had suffered mental contamination during his mission. They requested additional documentation, but Zechtel's attempts to show human boarding actions resulted in more psychological casualties among the council members. This behavior cannot represent normal conduct for any intelligent species, Mortak declared while reviewing sanitized portions of the combat footage. The humans must have been suffering from some form of mass psychological disorder that caused irrational decision-making under stress. Please prepare a standard report documenting their defeat by superior Vorthan forces. The observer tried to explain that humans had actually won the battle, but this information was rejected as obviously impossible given the mathematical analysis of force comparisons. The council concluded that Zechthel had misinterpreted tactical withdrawals or temporary repositioning as permanent Vorthan retreat. They ordered him to submit corrected documentation showing the expected human surrender and colonization by the Empire. Zechthel spent weeks attempting to write a report that satisfied council expectations but found himself unable to misrepresent what he had witnessed. Every night he reviewed his recordings, obsessively watching Commander Morrison teach his young daughter weapon maintenance while she sat on his lap. He observed Dr. Phillips crying alone in her medical facility after losing another patient to injuries that better equipment might have prevented. The footage of Captain Hayes proposing marriage to his wounded girlfriend in the ruins of their destroyed city played repeatedly in Zechtel's quarters. The human officer had waited until after the battle to ask the important question because he wanted to be certain he could protect the woman he loved. Their wedding ceremony took place among the graves of fallen soldiers with the entire surviving community in attendance. Late one evening, Zechthel realized why he couldn't file a standard report about primitive species being defeated by superior Technology. The humans weren't primitive at all despite their limited technology and short lifespans. They had achieved something that advanced galactic civilizations had forgotten during millions of cycles of peaceful evolution. They understood that some things were worth dying for. The observer deleted his official report files and submitted his resignation from the Confederation's observer corps through encrypted channels. His replacement would be assigned to monitor other species while Zechthel tried to process psychological contamination that had fundamentally changed his understanding of intelligent life. The peaceful civilization that had raised him could never comprehend what made humans so dangerous. His final log entry was recorded in personal files that would never be transmitted to council databases. I was sent to observe human military behavior during their inevitable defeat by superior Vorthan forces. Instead, I learned why humans cannot be truly defeated regardless of the odds they face. They fight not because they don't understand death, but because they understand that some things are worth dying for. The entry continued with observations that would terrify any peaceful species fortunate enough to avoid human contact. These beings will spread across the galaxy not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through the terrible realization that mortality gives meaning to existence. Every human death in battle serves as inspiration for the survivors to fight harder rather than evidence that resistance is futile. Zechthel sealed his personal quarters and began self-imposed exile from galactic society while reports of human victory began spreading through unofficial channels. Other species were taking notice of the small primitive creatures who had made the mighty Vorthan Empire retreat in defeat. Trade delegations and diplomatic missions started arriving at human colonies seeking contact with the species that had achieved the impossible. The observer's predictions proved accurate as human expansion accelerated beyond all galactic precedent. Within 50 cycles, human colonies existed in over 200 star systems, and their military doctrine was being studied by species that had never considered warfare as a solution to political problems. The age of human dominance was beginning, and the galaxy would never return to its previous state of peaceful stagnation. Zechthel spent his remaining years studying human philosophy and culture, trying to understand how mortality could generate such incredible strength rather than weakness. His private research revealed that humans drew inspiration from death rather than being weakened by it, because they viewed individual sacrifice as a pathway to species immortality. Every human who died protecting others became a model for future generations to emulate. The final entry in his personal logs was discovered after Zechthel's death from old age in his isolated research facility. I wish I had never accepted the assignment to observe humans in battle because ignorance was safer than knowledge. Now I understand that we have awakened something in the galaxy that will change everything. The humans are coming, and they bring with them the most dangerous weapon in the universe, the willingness to die for something greater than themselves.